There is a morning in late autumn when you go to the lake, and the swans are gone. Not fewer than yesterday. Not moved to the other end. Gone. The water that had 4 or 6 or a dozen of them on it for the entire summer is empty in a way that feels absolute. You might wait for a few minutes at the edge. You might walk the full perimeter. You might come back the next day thinking you missed them somehow, that they are behind the reeds or around the bend. They are not there. They left. And most people who experience this have no idea why, or when it happened, or where those specific birds went, or whether the swans that show up in spring are the same ones that were there before. The answers to those questions are more specific, more surprising, and more personal than most people expect. Because swan migration is not the anonymous mass movement that most people picture when they think of birds flying south for winter. It is individual. It is social. It involves decisions that specific birds make based on their history, their relationships, and information about conditions hundreds of miles away that they are processing in ways we are still working to understand. Stay until the end, because the last section covers something that happens during the migration itself. In the air, that almost nobody who watches swans on the water ever thinks about. Number 1. Not all swans leave, and the ones that stay are not the lucky ones. The first thing to understand about swan autumn departure is that it is not universal. In any given population of mute swans at a temperate lake, some birds will leave in autumn and some will not. The decision, if you can call it that, is not random. It follows a pattern that researchers have spent considerable effort mapping, and the pattern is more socially complex than the simple warm-cold calculation most people assume drives it. Established breeding pairs with strong territorial claims on a lake tend to be the last to leave and the first to return. In mild winters, at lakes that do not freeze and where aquatic vegetation remains accessible under the surface, they may not leave at all. The territory is an asset. Abandoning it, even temporarily, carries a cost. Another pair can move in. A rival male can establish a claim that has to be contested on return. The breeding pair that holds its ground through winter is buying security at the cost of comfort. The birds that leave first and travel furthest are the non-breeders. The young birds from this year's cohort, the first and second year birds that have not yet established territories, the failed breeders who lost their clutch and have no nest site investment to protect. These birds have less to lose by moving and more to gain. They are also, in most cases, less experienced at surviving winter in place. The territorial adults know their lake. They know which corner stays ice-free longest. They know which bank offers shelter from the prevailing wind. The young birds do not have that knowledge yet. What this produces, at any lake with a mixed swan population in October and November, is a staged departure. The youngest and least established birds thin out first. The established pairs hold on longer. And when the established pairs finally go, they are usually driven by a specific trigger rather than a general sense that winter is coming. That trigger is ice. Number 2. What ice does to a swan's world. To understand why ice drives swan departure, you have to understand what a swan's daily life actually requires. A mute swan feeding in temperate waters needs to access submerged aquatic vegetation at depths of typically 1 to 3 feet. It does this by upending, the familiar posture with the rear end in the air and the neck fully extended downward, reaching the bottom with a bill that is built for cropping and filtering soft plant material. This is not an emergency feeding strategy. It is the primary feeding strategy. It is how a swan in good habitat spends a significant part of every day. Ice makes this impossible. Not difficult. Impossible. A frozen lake surface cannot be upended through. The feeding that a swan's body budget requires simply cannot happen on a frozen lake, regardless of how much aquatic vegetation is underneath it. A large adult mute swan, weighing 25 to 30 pounds, has substantial fat reserves compared to a small songbird. But those reserves are not unlimited. Researchers calculating the energy budgets of wintering mute swans have estimated that an adult in good condition, unable to feed, can sustain itself for a limited number of days before the deficit becomes critical. In severe winters with extended freezing, swans that cannot or do not move to open water face starvation, on a timeline that is shorter than most people would guess for such a large bird. The decision to leave, when established birds finally make it, is therefore not a response to cold air temperature. Swans are well insulated, and cold air alone does not threaten them. It is a response to ice, actual or anticipated, and to the specific threat that ice represents to the feeding system their survival depends on. How they anticipate it, how they know that a lake 300 miles north of them is freezing before the ice reaches their own water, is one of the genuinely open questions in swan migration research. But the behavioral evidence is consistent. Birds begin departing before conditions at their departure location become critical. Something is informing the decision that goes beyond what they can directly observe from the surface of their own lake. Number 3, where they actually go, and how they know where that is. This is the part of the story that turns out to be deeply personal in a way that surprises people. Mute swans are not long-distance migrants in the way that warblers or shorebirds are. They do not cross continents. The movements of most European mute swan populations are relatively short by migratory standards, typically hundreds of miles rather than thousands. But those movements are not random, and they are not simply toward warmth in a general sense. Young swans making their first autumn movement follow adults. Specifically, they follow experienced birds from their own population, often their own parents, or the dominant birds from their natal area, to wintering sites that those experienced birds already know. The wintering site is learned. It is transmitted socially, from one generation to the next, through the simple mechanism of young birds following older ones. This has a consequence that researchers have found striking. Swan populations tend to have traditional wintering sites, specific estuaries, coastal bays, large rivers, that the same families and groups return to year after year across generations. The knowledge of where to go in winter is not innate. It is cultural. It exists in the population as accumulated experience, passed down through the behavioral chain of young birds following adults who were themselves once young birds following adults. When a traditional wintering site is degraded or destroyed through coastal development, water quality changes, or disturbance, the population that depended on it does not simply redirect to the nearest alternative. It loses something that took generations to build. The knowledge of where safety is in winter, for that group, is gone. The next generation has to find its way without the guide that every previous generation had. The swans that leave your lake in October are not going somewhere vague. They are going somewhere specific, somewhere that a bird in their family line has been going for longer than any individual alive can remember. Number 4. The journey itself. What migration actually costs a swan. People who watch swans on water rarely think about swans in the air. The two images do not naturally connect, but a mute swan in flight is a different kind of animal than the one you see drifting across a park lake. And what it does during migration is worth understanding. Mute swans are among the heaviest flying birds on Earth. A large male at peak autumn condition, with fat reserves built up for the journey, can weigh 30 pounds or more. Getting that mass airborne requires a running takeoff across the water surface, sometimes covering 100 meters before the bird achieves the speed needed to lift. Once airborne, a mute swan cruises at approximately 50 miles per hour. It is not fast by migratory bird standards, but it is sustained. Tracking data from GPS-tagged mute swans has documented individuals completing movements of 200 to 300 miles in single flights, typically at night or in the early morning hours when air is cooler and calmer. The energy cost of these flights is significant. Fat reserves that took weeks to accumulate can be substantially depleted in a single long flight under adverse conditions. Headwinds are particularly costly. A mute swan flying into a strong headwind is burning reserves at a rate that can make the difference between arriving at the wintering site in good condition and arriving depleted, vulnerable, and unable to compete effectively for the best feeding areas. This is why departure timing matters. Experienced birds do not leave into headwinds if they can avoid it. They wait. They read conditions. Through barometric pressure sensitivity, through wind direction, through cues that we understand incompletely, and they move when conditions favor the journey. The departure that looks sudden to the person who arrives at the lake one morning to find the swans gone was not sudden at all. It was timed. It was a decision made by birds that have been monitoring conditions for days or weeks, waiting for the window that makes the crossing survivable at acceptable cost. Number 5. What happens in the air? The thing almost nobody thinks about. Mute swans migrate in groups. Not the enormous anonymous flocks of some species, but in small parties, typically family units and loose associations of familiar birds. And they are not silent when they do it. The wing beat of a flying mute swan produces a distinctive rhythmic sound, a resonant throbbing that carries across considerable distances in calm night air. This sound is not incidental. It is how swans in a migrating group maintain contact in the dark. Visual contact between birds in a night flight formation is limited. The wing beat sound, specific to mute swans and recognizable as such, keeps the group together across the darkness. People who live under migration routes for mute swans describe hearing this sound passing overhead on autumn nights. Not seeing the birds. Hearing them. A rhythmic pulsing in the dark above the house, present for a minute or two and then gone, moving in a direction, purposeful in a way that is striking when you understand what it is. Those are your swans. The ones from the lake 3 miles away, or the ones passing through from a population further north, carrying the cultural knowledge of where winter safety is, flying in the dark by the sound of each other's wings, on a route that birds in their line have been flying for longer than the towns below them have existed. And in spring, some of them will be back. Not all of them. The winter has costs. Some birds do not survive it. The ones that return to your lake in late February or March are the ones that found the wintering site, held their ground through the cold months, accumulated the reserves for the return journey, and made it back through conditions that the ones that did not return could not. The swans that arrive in spring are not the same birds that left in autumn in any trivial sense. They have been somewhere. They have done something. They carry the experience of a winter that most of the people watching them from the bank have no framework to imagine. The lake is empty now. The water is flat and gray, and there is nothing on it. But somewhere down a coast you have never visited, or on an estuary you could not find on a map. The swans from your lake are there, feeding in the shallows, maintaining the social bonds that will determine who gets which territory when they return, waiting, in the way that swans wait, for the conditions that tell them it is time to come back. They know the way home. They have always known it. You just had no idea how far they had been. Tell me in the comments, have you ever noticed the swans disappear from a lake near you in autumn and come back in spring? Did the same birds return, or did different ones show up? Tell me what you observed. I read every single one.